How much of your reality is actually yours? I don't mean that in a vague, create your own universe kind of way. I mean it in a more practical, uncomfortable sense. How much of what you believe has come from direct experience? And how much of it has been handed to you by culture, fear, hope, trauma, or some very confident person who sounds like they know something you don't? Most of us like to think we can spot nonsense when we see it. We imagine belief as a clean little process. Truth over here, bullshit over there. Nice and tidy. But it rarely works like that. We believe things because they meet a need in us. Sometimes that's intellectual, sometimes it's emotional, sometimes it's spiritual. Sometimes something feels true before we have any solid reason to believe that it is. And that feeling can be powerful. And it can also be dangerous. Carlos Castaneda, our focus for this episode, sits right in the middle of that problem. In the late 1960s, Castaneda arrived with a story that seemed to offer a doorway out of ordinary reality. He was an anthropology student at UCLA who claimed to have met a Yaqui man of knowledge named Don Juan Matus. Through Don Juan, he described a world of sorcery, discipline, altered perception, psychedelic plants, spiritual tests, and hidden knowledge. Now, for a lot of people, this wasn't just a book. It was permission to question the ordinary world, permission to distrust the version of reality they'd inherited, and permission to believe that consciousness could be trained, stretched, broken open, and rebuilt into something sharper. And to be fair, of course, there's something attractive in that. Who hasn't wondered whether the life they're living is being filtered through someone else's expectations? Who hasn't felt trapped inside habits, roles, fears, and inherited scripts? Who hasn't wanted someone to come along and say, look, this isn't all there is, there's another way of seeing. That is part of Castaneda's appeal. But this is where we have to be careful. His books were not presented as ordinary fiction. They were presented as anthropology, as fieldwork, as a record of apprenticeship with a real indigenous teacher. So we're not only talking about imagination, we're talking about evidence, about responsibility. We're talking about whether someone used the authority of another culture to give weight to a story that may not have been true. And this is important because spiritual hunger can make us vulnerable. When we want meaning badly enough, we can start lowering the bar for what we're willing to accept. We can mistake intensity for insight, mystery for depth, confidence for wisdom. So I'm not going to be doing a takedown in this episode, but I'm not going to be doing a rescue mission of Castaneda either. We're going to look at Carlos Castaneda as clearly as we can. His background, his claims, his books, his philosophy, his use of psychedelic experience, his influence, and the rather uncomfortable legacy that he left behind. The question here isn't whether Castaneda told the truth. It's why the story worked. 835. Before Carlos Castaneda became a spiritual figure, he was a student. And I think that's probably the best place to start because it makes the whole thing feel a bit less grand and a bit more human. Before Don Juan, before sorcery, before the arguments about whether any of it actually happened, Castaneda was someone studying how people understand the world. Anthropology, at its best, asks a very awkward question. What if the way we see reality is not just reality? What if it's training? What if what we call normal is actually a set of habits we've inherited from culture, family, language, fear, and all the other invisible hands that shape us before we even realize we're being shaped? There's nothing mystical about that, it's just what culture does. It gives us a little map. But then after a while we forget that it's a map and we start calling it the world. Carlos Castaneda was born on the 25th of December 1925 in Cajamarca, Peru. I'm probably pronouncing all of this really fucking wrong, so I apologize. And died on the 27th of April 1998 in Los Angeles. He became known as a Peruvian-born anthropologist and writer whose books had a huge influence on what later became known as the New Age movement. But even here at the beginning, things aren't simple. His basic biographical details are widely recorded, but his life and work are surrounded by dispute, and many critics eventually came to see his books as more fiction than fact. So that's Castaneda in miniature. You start with a fact, then you immediately find yourself standing beside a question. He moved to the United States in the 1950s and studied anthropology at UCLA. Now, Castaneda wasn't presenting himself at first as a novelist. He wasn't saying, here's a symbolic story about a mysterious teacher. This is no Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He was operating inside an academic discipline. He was working in a space that asks for evidence, method, dates, places, field notes, and some basic accountability. Now, that doesn't mean that anthropology has always behaved well. Western academics studying indigenous cultures have often brought their own arrogance, fantasies, projections, and assumptions with them. Let's not pretend otherwise. But this is why accuracy is important. If you claim to be writing about another culture's knowledge, especially indigenous knowledge, you don't get to be casual with the truth. You don't get to borrow the authority of a people and then shrug when someone asks you whether you represented them properly. And that's not being pedantic, it's about being responsible. In the early 1960s, Castaneda claimed to have met a man named Don Juan Matus. Don Juan was presented as a Yaqui man from Sonora, Mexico, and as a man of knowledge. Now, this wasn't someone who was just going to tell him some things about plants or ritual or belief. This man was a teacher, some say a sorcerer, someone who could train him to see beyond the ordinary surface of the world. Notice the word there, claimed. Castaneda claimed to have met him. Now that word has to stay because without it we accidentally give the story more certainty than it deserves, and with Castaneda that's how the trouble starts. Small acts of certainty placed where uncertainty should be. His first book, The Teachings of Don Juan, A Yaqui Way of Knowledge, was published by University of California Press in 1968. It wasn't presented as ordinary fiction. It was presented as anthropology, as a record of apprenticeship with a real indigenous teacher. UC Press itself describes the book as a controversial work that's been read both as ethnographic account and creative fiction. Now, of course, these are not the same thing. A fictional story can be deeply meaningful. A myth can tell us something real about fear, ego, death, transformation, and this very strange business of being alive. Fiction can be more honest than fact when it knows what it is. The problem comes when fiction wants the status of fact without accepting the burden of fact. If I write a novel about a fictional philosopher who lives in a shed and teaches people the meaning of life through bad tea and worse advice, you can judge it as fiction. You can ask whether it works, whether it moves you, whether the ideas hold together. But if I say, this is a real philosopher from a real living tradition, and I'm bringing you his teachings, then you're allowed to ask basic questions. Who was he? Where did you meet him? Can anyone else verify this? Does what you're describing actually reflect the culture you say it comes from? Now, this isn't being closed-minded. This is refusing to hand over your discernment at the door. This is even more important in Castaneda's case because the book landed at exactly the right moment. The late 1960s were full of people questioning the official version of reality, as you've probably picked up from some previous episodes on this series. Governments were not trusted, institutions were not trusted. The respectable adult world looked to many people as though it had lost its moral authority. There was war, social unrest, political disillusionment, and a growing feeling that Western society had become materially powerful and spiritually thin. People weren't just looking for information, they were looking for another way to live, and Castaneda appeared to offer one. Through Don Juan, he described a path of discipline, fear, altered perception, psychedelic plants, spiritual tests, and hidden knowledge. The early work includes the use of psychoactive plants such as peyote and datura, mescalito, but it was not framed as casual drug use. It was framed as an initiation. There was a teacher, a method, a danger, and a purpose. Now that's very different from someone saying, I took something in a field and saw God in a hedge. And the difference is structure. A strange experience by itself can be confusing. It can be beautiful, terrifying, useful, or completely self-indulgent. Sometimes it's insight. Sometimes it's your nervous system doing interpretive dance under chemical pressure. What Castaneda offered was a framework. He gave altered states a story. He made them part of training. He made them part of becoming someone. And what made this so powerful is that most people aren't only looking for experiences. They're looking for meaning. They want to know that the difficult thing they went through had a purpose. They want to know that the fear, confusion, grief, uncertainty, or weird little collapse of identity wasn't just random. They want it to be part of a path. Now, Castaneda understood this. His books told people that ordinary reality was not the final authority. They told people that perception could be trained. They suggested that the self was not fixed but could be broken open, disciplined, and remade. Now you can see the appeal. Who hasn't felt trapped inside a version of themselves they didn't choose? Who hasn't looked at their life and thought, is this really mine? Or have I just inherited a pile of expectations and mistaken them for identity? This is where Castaneda gets under the skin. Now, of course, not everyone who read him was gullible. That's a bit too easy, and it's a bit of a smug statement. Castaneda worked because he touched something real. The part of people that knows the ordinary self can become a narrow arrangement. The part that wants freedom, not in the shallow sense of doing whatever we like, but in the deeper sense of not being ruled by fear, habit, approval, and all the other little tyrants we carry around inside us. But a meaningful idea does not automatically make the story true. Something can be useful and still be invented. Something can change your life and still not be historically accurate. Something can contain wisdom and still be wrapped in bullshit. And this is where Castaneda becomes difficult. His work sits right on that fault line. There are ideas in the book that people found genuinely useful, but the historical claims beneath those ideas became harder and harder to defend. Scholars questioned the connection between Castaneda's material and actual Yaqui culture. Edward H. Spicer, a major authority on Yaqui culture, criticized the link between the book's subject matter and Yaqui tradition, calling that connection wholly gratuitous. Now that's not a minor criticism. If the Yaqui framing gives the book its authority and that framing is weak, the whole thing starts to wobble. So for now, we have a student, a teacher he claimed to have met, a book that arrived at exactly the right cultural moment, and a question already sitting underneath the whole thing. When we go looking for another way to see, how do we make sure we're not simply handing our sight to someone else? Once the first book had done its work, Castaneda's story began to shift. At the beginning, it looked like a book about plants, peyote, datura, mushrooms, strange journeys, stranger visions. The sort of thing that made sense in the late 1960s. But if you stay with Castaneda's work, the plants become less central. The deeper idea in the Don Juan books is not simply that drugs reveal another world. Castaneda's bigger claim was that perception itself could be trained. The real issue was not only what you saw during an altered state. The real issue was the machinery of seeing. How do you construct reality? What are you leaving out? What have you been taught to notice? And what have you been taught to ignore? In the books, Don Juan is constantly trying to interrupt Castaneda's ordinary way of thinking. He challenges his assumptions, frustrates his need for explanation, and pushes him toward experiences that don't fit neatly inside his rational framework. The point isn't just to have visions. The point is to loosen the grip of the ordinary self. Now we need to keep our caution in place. When I say Don Juan teaches, I mean as Castaneda presents him. We are still inside Castaneda's account. We're still dealing with a figure whose historical existence is disputed. So the safer way to listen to this isn't as a reliable record of an indigenous teacher, but as ideas Castaneda put into Don Juan's mouth. But those ideas are worth looking at. One of the most important is the idea of stopping the world. In Journey to Ixtlan, published in 1972, again, I've probably totally botched the pronunciation of this, Castaneda presents this as a major part of the apprenticeship. The ordinary world is treated as something held together by perception, habit, description, and agreement. To stop the world is to interrupt that process. To stop automatically accepting the usual version of things. To see without forcing everything into the categories you already know. In plain terms, it's the difference between looking at life and recognizing life. That might sound subtle, but it's not. Most of us experience our labels. Someone doesn't reply to a message and suddenly we aren't dealing with a phone. We're dealing with abandonment, disrespect, rejection, imagined motives, and a whole little courtroom in the head. Evidence may enter the building eventually, but usually after the verdict. Castaneda's philosophy asks what might happen if we could interrupt that. Not permanently and not perfectly, but just enough to notice that the story we're telling may not be the thing itself. This is where his work overlaps with something psychologically useful. You don't need to believe in sorcery to see the value in questioning your automatic interpretations. And you don't need to believe in Don Juan to understand that a person can live inside a cramped and repetitive version of themselves. We all do it. We decide we're anxious, so everything becomes proof of anxiety. We decide we're unlucky, so every setback becomes part of the evidence. We decide someone is against us, so even neutral behaviour starts wearing a little villain costume. It's ridiculous when you say it out loud, but we all do some version of it. Castaneda's language for this is more dramatic, but the underlying point has force. The self is not just something we are, it's something we keep rehearsing. Another major idea in Castaneda's work is the figure of the warrior. Now, this can easily sound ridiculous if you aren't careful. The word warrior has been dragged through so much self-help bullshit that it now often means a man with a podcast mic, a supplement code to athletic greens, and some unresolved intimacy issues. But in Castaneda's work, the warrior isn't simply someone who dominates. The warrior is someone who tries to live with discipline, attention, and what the books call impeccability. That means not wasting energy on self-pity, vanity, complaint, and endless personal drama. It means acting with care because life is limited, death is close, and attention is precious. Again, you don't have to buy the whole package to see why this lands. Most of us waste enormous amounts of energy defending an identity we don't even enjoy living inside. We spend energy proving we're right, proving we're wronged, proving we're special, proving we're damaged, that we're misunderstood. It's exhausting. It's a full-time job with no fucking benefits. The warrior idea says, stop feeding that. Now, this isn't because our feelings aren't important or because pain isn't real. It's because there's a difference between feeling something honestly and building a shrine to it. There's a difference between grief and identity, between fear and obedience. Then, of course, there's death. In Castaneda's books, death isn't treated as an abstract future event. It's treated as an advisor, something close, something intimate, something that strips away petty concerns by reminding us that time isn't unlimited. Now, this idea isn't unique to Castaneda. You can find versions of it in Stoicism, Buddhism, Christianity, existentialism, and probably in any honest person who's had some sort of health scare. But Castaneda gives it a particular flavour. Death isn't there to make life bleak. Death is there to sharpen attention. Ask yourself what actually matters if death isn't theoretical. That's a brutal question, but it's also a useful one. A lot of what we call importance is just social noise with a slightly better haircut, status, approval, pettiness, the need to win arguments that won't matter in 6 months, let alone at the end of a life. Now, this is where Castaneda's philosophy has a bit of bite. It asks us to stop living as if life is endless rehearsal. It asks us to notice where we are asleep inside habit. It asks us to treat perception as something active, not passive. But we also have to say this clearly. A powerful philosophy does not prove the story behind it. The concepts may be useful. They may even be transformative. But that doesn't mean that Don Juan existed. It doesn't mean the Yaqui framing is accurate, and it doesn't mean that Castaneda's claimed apprenticeship happened as described. Spiritual ideas often become dangerous when we stop separating usefulness from truth. We think, this helped me, therefore it must be real. Or, this changed me, therefore the teacher must be trustworthy. But those things don't follow. A false story can move you. A flawed teacher can say something useful. A powerful metaphor can still be wrapped in a lie. Now that's why Castaneda can be a bit difficult to handle. If we dismiss him completely, we miss why the work mattered. If we swallow him whole, we lose the ability to think clearly. So we have to do the harder thing. We have to hold both. The philosophy of Castaneda is at best a challenge to automatic living. It asks whether we're actually seeing the world or just repeating the version of it that we were handed. It asks whether our identity is something alive or just a script we keep performing because we've forgotten that we can stop. But the very same philosophy also creates a problem. If ordinary reality is only a description, then who gets to replace it? Who gets to tell you what's really going on? Who becomes the guide? Now that's where the ground starts to shift. The desire to see differently can be liberating, but it can also make you very easy to lead. By the time Castaneda's work started to catch fire, the problem was no longer just whether people enjoyed the books. People clearly did. The problem was whether the books were true. And that's a very different question. Enjoyment is easy to defend. You can like a book because it unsettles you, or because it gives language to something you felt but never managed to say. You can like it because it makes the world feel wider for a while. No crime there. We've all been changed by stories that weren't factual. This is part of what stories are for. The problem with Castaneda's books was the wrapping of anthropological authority. That meant they had to answer to something more than atmosphere, and this is where the trouble began. As more people looked closely at his work, the central claims became harder to hold. Don Juan Matus couldn't be independently verified. The fieldwork wasn't available in the way scholars would expect. The dates, places, and details were difficult to check, and the connection to Yaqui culture, which gave the first book so much of its force, came under serious criticism. The Yaqui framing wasn't decorative. It was part of the authority of the book. It made Don Juan feel rooted. It made the teachings feel ancient, indigenous, and real. Without that grounding, the whole thing starts to look less like anthropology and more like one man's spiritual fiction, which, to put it mildly, is a problem. Then came Richard DeMille. DeMille was one of Castaneda's most important critics, and he didn't approach the work with polite little tweezers. In Castaneda's Journey and later the Don Juan Papers, he argued that the books were fabrications, full of inconsistencies, borrowed ideas, and suspiciously convenient scenes. The Don Juan Papers gathered criticism around Castaneda and helped shift the public conversation away from, "Is this profound?" toward, "Hang on, did any of this actually happen?" And that's a brutal shift, because once you start asking that question, the spell changes. You stop reading Don Juan as a hidden master and start seeing him as a literary device. You stop seeing the desert as a sacred training ground and start wondering whether it's a stage set. And you stop seeing the apprentice's confusion as proof of deep initiation and start wondering whether Castaneda was just very good at making vagueness feel meaningful. And he was good at it. That's part of the problem. Bad frauds are easy. They come at you with cheap robes, recycled quotes, and a little card payment device linked to their PayPal. You can spot them from the next county. Castaneda isn't that simple. His books have texture. They have scenes that stay with people. They contain ideas about perception, fear, death, discipline, and identity that genuinely resonated with readers. That's why the criticism lands in such an uncomfortable place. It's not just, "This is nonsense." It's, "This may be powerful and still not true," and that is significantly harder to deal with. Most of us want things to line up. If something moves us, we want it to be real. If something helps us, we want it to be trustworthy. If a teacher says something that cuts through our excuses, we want the teacher to be solid all the fucking way down. But people are rarely solid all the way down. Sometimes the thing that helps us comes from a flawed person. Fucking always does, doesn't it? Sometimes a useful idea arrives in a dishonest package. Sometimes we mistake the emotional impact of a teaching for evidence that the whole structure around it must be sound. Castaneda is a warning about how belief works. Spiritual belief isn't just an intellectual process. It is need, longing, fear, hope, loneliness, curiosity, rebellion, boredom, grief, and the suspicion that there must be more to life than whatever dull little arrangement we've inherited. Breathe. That was a long one. Castaneda understood that audience. Maybe he understood them because he was one of them. Maybe he understood them because he knew how to write for them, or maybe both are true. By the 1970s, the counterculture was already full of people trying to break out of conventional thought. So when Castaneda presented a teacher who mocked ordinary certainty, disrupted rational habits, and treated reality as something flexible, it felt like a revelation. But the same thing that made the teaching exciting also made it slippery. If ordinary reality is just a description, then evidence can start to look like a trap. If doubt is treated as a failure of perception, criticism can be dismissed as spiritual blindness. If the teacher lives beyond normal categories, then every contradiction can be turned into another lesson. That is a very dangerous move. Because at some point, the refusal to be trapped by ordinary thinking can become the refusal to be accountable to anything at all. This is the crisis in Castaneda's work. Not simply that he might have made things up. Writers make things up, it happens. This isn't new. The crisis is that he appears to have presented invention as fieldwork, mythology as anthropology, and personal spiritual theatre as indigenous knowledge. And once that happens, we are placed in a strange position. If you question the story, you may feel as though you're betraying the insight you found in it. If you defend the story, you may find yourself defending claims that don't stand up very well to interrogation. So either you throw the whole fucking thing away, or you protect it too fiercely. Neither response is quite right. The more honest response is more annoying, which is usually a sign that it's closer to the truth. We have to separate the effect of the work from the claims of the work. The effect may be real, but the claims may be false. A book can wake something up in you without being a reliable account of history. A metaphor can be useful without being literal. A teacher can be fictional and still reveal something about the student. But if the author asks us to treat that fiction as evidence, then we are allowed to ask for it. That is not being small-minded. That is being discerned. And discernment is especially important in spiritual territory, because this is where people are most likely to confuse surrender with depth. They think letting go of judgment means letting go of judgment entirely. But good judgment isn't the enemy of spiritual growth. It stops spiritual growth turning into a fucking circus. So by the end of this section, the question has changed slightly. We are no longer simply asking whether Castaneda's ideas are interesting. They are. I've read The Teachings of Don Juan, and it's a really fucking good book, especially the bit with the skinwalker and when he turns into a bird and wakes up naked by the side of the road. It's great. The Mescalito wolf with 100 tails is absolutely brilliant. Go and read it. What we're asking is what happens when interesting ideas are protected by unverifiable claims. What happens when mystery becomes a shield against scrutiny? What happens when the desire to see differently makes us vulnerable to being misled? Castaneda didn't only write about altered perception. He created a situation where readers had to decide how much uncertainty they were willing to tolerate before wisdom started to look like manipulation. By the time Castaneda reached the final stretch of his life, the story had changed again. At the beginning, he was the student. Then he became the author. Then he became a somewhat controversial spiritual figure. But in the last act of his public life, if we can even call it public, he became something more troubling. He became the centre of a private world. And this is where we need to tread carefully, because it's very easy to turn this part into something lurid. Missing women, secretive followers, a guru figure, a Los Angeles compound. The whole thing has the texture of a Netflix documentary that would have way too much bass in the trailer. The point is not to sensationalize it. The point is to ask what happens when ideas about freedom, perception, and spiritual discipline become attached to one person's authority. That's the danger here. Castaneda had spent years writing about breaking the description of the world. He'd written about escaping ordinary reality, losing a self, becoming a warrior, and seeing beyond the normal arrangement of things. On the page, some of that can sound profound. It can sound like liberation, like a way to stop being trapped by fear, habit, ego, and all the other little shit of ordinary life. But those ideas change when they move from the page into a closed social world. A concept that challenges your ego can be useful. A person who claims the right to dismantle your identity can be fucking dangerous. There's a very important distinction. In the later years, Castaneda became increasingly reclusive. Reports describe him withdrawing from public life and gathering a circle of devoted followers, many of them women, around him in Los Angeles. Some were known as his witches or chakmuls. Salon's 2007 investigation describes a secretive group around Castaneda in the last decade of his life, and former insiders spoke about women who cut ties with family, changed names, and became deeply absorbed in his world. Again, we need to be careful with language. Not every intense spiritual group is a cult. That's the first thing I wanted to lead with, if I'm honest. The cult of Castaneda. Not every demanding teacher is abusive, and not every person who changes their name or leaves an old life behind has been manipulated. People sometimes do make extreme choices because they genuinely want a different life. Human beings are messy. We don't need to flatten this into a cartoon. But we also shouldn't be naive. When a teacher becomes the center of reality, normal safeguards start to fall away. The group becomes the world. The language of the group becomes the language of thought. Doubt becomes weakness. Outside concern becomes ignorance. Family becomes interference. Criticism becomes proof that the critic doesn't understand. And this is when the whole thing starts to smell a bit like a stale fish market. Not because spiritual communities are automatically bad, they're not. At their best, they can give people discipline, friendship, direction, and a place to ask questions that normal life often doesn't make room for. But at their worst, they can create an anechoic chamber where reality is negotiated by one person at the top. And if that person is unstable, dishonest, narcissistic, or simply drunk on their own mythology, the damage can be enormous. Castaneda died on 27th of April 1998. His death was quiet, almost hidden. Reports say it was not publicly known until weeks later. After his death, several women closely connected to his inner circle disappeared. Patricia Partin, also known as Nuri Alexander, was one of them. Her car was found abandoned near Death Valley, and years later, remains found in the Panamint Dunes were identified as hers. The official cause of death was undetermined. Other women connected to the group, including Florinda Donna Grau, Taisha Abela, Amalia Marquez, and Kylie Lundahl, were also reported missing after Castaneda's death. The Charlie Project lists Amalia Marquez as last seen in Los Angeles in April 1998 and describes her connection to Clear Green, the organization connected with Castaneda's teachings. This is a somewhat grim place to arrive, and it should give us a moment to pause. This is no longer just about whether Don Juan existed. It's no longer just about whether the anthropology was sound or whether the philosophy has useful bits in it. We are now looking at the human cost of a closed spiritual world. This is where Castaneda's philosophy turns back on itself. He wrote about freedom from the ordinary self, but what if losing that self makes a person more vulnerable to control? He wrote about escaping social conditioning, but what if the new conditioning is harder to question because it calls itself liberation? He wrote about death as an advisor, but what happens when that language becomes entangled with people who have surrendered too much of their ordinary grounding? Spiritual teachings often ask people to loosen their attachment to identity. There can be value in that. Most of us carry a self-image that's part truth, part defense mechanism, and part badly written fan fiction. Questioning that can be healthy. But identity also protects us. Your name, your relationships, your history, your ordinary obligations, all those boring fucking routines, even your skeptical little inner voice that says, hang on a minute, this sounds weird. All of that can keep you connected to reality. It might not feel very mystical, might not get you invited to the cool room with incense and cryptic eye contact, but it does have relevance. Because when someone convinces you that your old self must be destroyed, you need to ask who benefits from the destruction. Do you become freer, or do you become easier to shape? That is the question that we now have to sit with. The tragedy of Castaneda's later circle is that the language of transformation seems to have become part of a world that many former observers and critics describe as controlling and secretive. We don't need to pretend that we know every detail of what happened inside that world. We don't, and we shouldn't invent certainty where the record is incomplete, but we can say this. When a spiritual teacher removes themselves from ordinary accountability, when followers are encouraged to cut themselves off from previous relationships, when the teacher's mythology becomes more important than basic reality, something has gone badly wrong. Not interestingly wrong and not mysteriously wrong. Wrong in a very serious fucking sense. And we have to talk about this because spiritual seeking often begins in a sincere place. People are not stupid for wanting meaning. They are not weak for wanting guidance. And they certainly aren't foolish for wanting to believe that life contains more than work, bills, performance, and waiting for the fucking kettle to boil. That hunger is very real, but it can also be weaponized. This is the uncomfortable lesson that Castaneda leaves behind. The same desire that leads a person toward insight can also lead them into dependence. The same openness that makes transformation possible can make manipulation easier. The same willingness to question reality can become a trap if someone else gets to decide what reality is. So by the end of this section, our story has darkened a bit. We began with a student looking for knowledge. We moved through books that challenged perception. We watched that evidence begin to crack. And now we're left with something a bit harder to dismiss. Not just a questionable author or a disputed teacher, but something that's gone a bit down cult territory, where the cost of belief might have been far greater than the books ever admitted. And that, for me, forces the question into a much sharper focus. When a path asks you to give up the self, how do you know whether you're being liberated from illusion or separated from the very things that keep you sane? So, where does all of this leave us? Because by this point, it'd be easy to make this episode really simple. Castaneda lied, Don Juan probably doesn't exist, the anthropology doesn't hold up, and the later circle around him became deeply troubling. Case closed. Except it's not quite that simple, and I know that's annoying. There's a part of us that wants these stories to resolve neatly. We want the good teacher or the bad fraud, the holy man or the manipulator, the wisdom or the bullshit. Pick a shelf, put him on it. Maybe add a little label so nobody has to think too hard. But Castaneda resists that. And not because we deserve him any special protection, but because the problem he represents is genuinely complicated. His work seems to have misled people. It borrowed the authority of indigenous tradition in ways that don't stand up well to scrutiny. It blurred the line between fieldwork and fiction. And later, that private world around him appears to have carried real human costs. We shouldn't soften any of that. But we also have to deal with another fact. The books meant something to people. Not in some shallow way, not in a this was a fun mystical beach read kind of way. They gave people a language for questioning who they were, what they believed, and how much of their life had been built out of automatic thought. That's important too. People don't usually cling to spiritual ideas because they're bored and have run out of things to alphabetize. They cling to them because something in their life feels unresolved. They are grieving. They are trapped. They are tired of themselves. They're tired of the smallness of the world they've been given. They want a crack in the wall. Castaneda gave them one, or seemed to. And this is where we need to make a distinction that is simple but not easy. A story can be useful without being true. A metaphor can be powerful without being literal. A book can wake something up in you while still being historically unreliable. This happens more often than we'd like to admit. A film changes how you see grief. A novel helps you understand your father. A myth gives shape to a fear you could never name properly. None of that requires the story to have happened exactly as written. The problem begins when the story demands the status of fact. If Castaneda has said, I've written a philosophical fiction about perception and transformation, then we'd be judging a very different thing. We could talk about the ideas, we could talk about the characters, we could talk about the way Don Juan functions as a figure of disruption and discipline. But that is not how the work arrived. It arrived as a testimony, as apprenticeship, as a record of knowledge passed from a real teacher to a real student. That claim gave the books their power. It also created the ethical problem. Symbolic truth is not the same as historical truth, and confusing the two is where things get very messy. Actually, messy is a generous word. I would say it gets dangerous, and this is especially true in spiritual life. If a story moves you, that is worth noticing. But if it starts asking you to surrender your discernment, cut yourself off from criticism, ignore evidence, or treat doubt as a moral failure, then the story is no longer just moving you. It is managing you. And nobody needs that dressed up as awakening. The useful parts of Castaneda, if we're going to keep anything, have to be separated from the machinery of belief around him. The idea that perception can be trained is useful. The idea that we live through inherited descriptions of the world I'm in complete agreement with. The idea that death can clarify what matters is a seriously good one. And the idea that self-pity, vanity and personal drama can drain a life of energy is something that we should all adhere to, even if it does slightly ruin a lot of dinner conversations. But none of those ideas require us to believe that Don Juan existed. They do not require us to accept Castaneda's anthropology. And they don't require us to excuse the later damage. This is the adult position, really. Take the idea seriously, but don't kneel before the person who packaged it. That is harder than it sounds, because we like our wisdom clean. We like it to come from people who we can admire without reservation. We like to imagine that if an idea is valuable, the person who brought it must also be valuable in the same way. But of course, life does not work like that. Sometimes useful ideas come from deeply flawed people. Sometimes people who see one thing clearly are blind in other areas. Sometimes a person can help you understand freedom while creating a very unfree world around themselves. That doesn't mean that we throw away discernment. It means we use more of it. This is where Castaneda becomes useful again, but not in the way that he intended. He becomes less of a guide and more of a case study, not a map to follow, but a warning about maps themselves. He shows us how easily longing can be converted into belief. He shows us how quickly mystery can become authority. He shows us how a person can talk about freedom while drawing others into dependence. And he shows us that the desire to escape illusion can become its own illusion itself. I think that's probably worth sitting with. I think we all do this, just usually slightly less dramatically. We do it with teachers, with books, with political movements, with therapists, with business gurus, with spiritual systems, with fitness instructors who appear to have been assembled entirely from discipline and chicken breast. We find something that explains... Sorry. Fucking hell. Okay. I have been made from discipline and chicken breast. We find something that explains us to ourselves, I guess, and then we want it to explain everything. And that's the danger. Not that we believe. Belief is part of being human. You can't live without some kind of belief. Even extreme skepticism is founded in belief. The danger is when belief stops being alive, when it stops being examined, when it becomes identity, when we are no longer using an idea but being used by it. That's why the question here isn't simply, was Castaneda a fraud? That's too small a question. The better one is, what happens in us when we need the fraud to be true? That's where the real work begins. If a teaching helps you become more honest, more grounded, more responsible, and more connected to reality, then maybe there's something worth keeping. But if it makes you less able to question, less able to listen, less able to admit uncertainty, and less able to stay connected to ordinary human obligations, then it doesn't matter how mystical it sounds. It's not freeing you. It's shrinking you. That for me is where Castaneda finally lands. Not as a prophet, but not just as a fraud either, but as a reminder that wisdom and deception are not always found in separate rooms. Sometimes they sit at the same table. Sometimes they use the same language. And sometimes they even produce the same feeling at first. Which means we have to have more openness. We need discernment. Not the cold, cynical kind that rejects everything before it can touch us. That isn't wisdom. That is just another form of fear. We need the kind of discernment that can say, this moved me, but I still need to ask what it is. The kind that can hold meaning without surrendering judgment. The kind that can learn from a story without being owned by it. If Castaneda teaches us anything, it may be this. The question is not whether we should seek another way of seeing. Of course we should. The question is whether, in trying to see beyond the ordinary world, do we lose the ability to see what's right in front of us? So what do we do with Carlos Castaneda? That's still the uncomfortable question. If we reduce him to a fraud, we miss something important about why his work mattered. But if we rescue him too quickly, if we wrap the whole thing in vague language about mystery and higher truth, we avoid the harder responsibility of looking clearly at what happened. And clarity matters here. Castaneda didn't simply write peculiar books. He presented those books as records of apprenticeship, as anthropology, as encounters with an indigenous teacher who may never have existed. That gave the work its force, but it also gave it its ethical problem. Stories are allowed to be stories, myths are allowed to be myths, and fiction is allowed to invent. But when a story asks to be treated as evidence, when it borrows the authority of a real culture, when it asks people to believe not just in the meaning of the tale, but in the factual truth of the tale itself, then we are allowed to ask for more. We are allowed to ask what happened. We are allowed to ask who benefits. And we are allowed to ask what the belief is doing to us. That doesn't mean we have to become cold or closed off. I don't think skepticism should become its own little prison where nothing's allowed to touch us unless it's been approved by 3 independent witnesses. That would be a miserable way to live. But openness without discernment is just another kind of vulnerability. and Castaneda's life shows us both sides of that. His books speak to something real, the desire to see differently, to interrupt habit, to stop living entirely through fear, ego, approval, and all the stale descriptions we mistake for ourselves. Those questions are important, and they're not invalidated just because the man who carried them may have been deeply unreliable. But of course that unreliability matters too, as does the missing evidence, the disputed cultural claims, the later issues with private circle. I'm using private circle, it's fucking cult. The later issues with the cult, basically, and the people affected by his authority. All of these things are important as well. So perhaps Castaneda is most useful now when we stop treating him as a guide and start treating him as a warning. A warning about charisma, a warning about spiritual hunger, and a warning about how easily we can mistake intensity for truth, mystery for depth, and surrender for growth. Because most of us at some point go looking for another way to see. We look for a teacher, a book, a system, a philosophy, a path. We look because ordinary life feels too narrow, too repetitive, and too fucking flat. And there is nothing wrong with that search. But what do we give away while searching? Do we become more honest, more grounded, more awake to reality? Or do we simply trade one description of the world for another and call the new one freedom because it feels a bit more interesting? That in the end, my friends, may be the real lesson. Not that we should never enter the desert, but that if we do, we should keep hold of our eyes. Thank you, you beautiful lot, for tuning in today. Your time, your presence, your attention are, as always, deeply appreciated. Now, if any of these reflections or ideas resonate with you today, then you can join the conversation in all the usual digital purgatories. We're in the third realm of hell on TikTok, Instagram, and X with the handle @TheObservingEye. We're also on YouTube at youtube.com/@TheObservingEye as well. And we're on Substack, which is the home of the podcast, at theobservingeye.com. And of course, you can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get yours. You can also drop me an email at david@theobservingeye.com. I do read them, and I will do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. So if you want to recommend a subject for an episode, or you just want to say hi, you can feel free to send me a message, and I will get back to you, I promise. I want to say thank you to the people who have messaged me last week. I had a really good one from someone giving me a bit more information about Aldous Huxley that I had completely missed. So I talked about Huxley's deteriorating vision as being a driving force in his ideas around perception and the quest for the soul. But there are some more interesting facts around Huxley that I did not include, which are that his mother died when he was 14 and his brother committed suicide when he was 19, which I think gives it a bit more context and a bit more depth. So I appreciate that. Thank you for pulling me up on it, on my missed content, because, you know, this is a podcast about philosophy, right? So it's about discussion and challenging ideas and being accountable when you are wrong. That's important. So I take that, and thank you very much. You know who you are. I'm not naming names. We have GDPR in the UK. I'll get ruined. Next week, we are back. We are back with more of the realm of the Psychonauts. I haven't decided who I'm going to do yet. Not like that. You have a filthy mind. Oh, hang on. There's my food. My food delivery has turned up. Here he is. Sorry, totally off track there. Where was I? Yes, next week, Realm of the Psychonauts, episode 150. That's a big milestone, 150 episodes. There he is. There's my food. One moment, caller. I better go and get it. Where was I? Right, next week. No idea who it's going to be, so it'll be as much as a surprise to you as it is to me. That's it, I think. Until next week, then. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.